I've just written a lecture for some master's students, which I called How Long Till Black Futures Month. I took the name from an essay and a collection of short stories by the Black Afro-Futures author N.K. Jemisin. In her essay, Jemisin explains why we should avoid taking only a historical racial lens to look at society. There's an importance for envisioning futures for those who are currently oppressed, as well as dealing with our own current situation. But we must start with history to understand a bit about where we are now. We know about Noah and his ark, the floods and the covenant of the rainbow. Into the ark you go with your partners and sons, Beni Noach, the sons of Noah. We know about the 40 days and the 40 nights, and eventually they emerged. But when Noah comes out, he plants a vineyard and gets drunk. And whilst drunk, one of Beni Noach, the sons of Noah, did something to him that is deserving of receiving a really terrible curse. We can't say for certain exactly what he did to get cursed, but we do know that there are many other curses and pronouncements in the Torah. However, the ramifications of this particular one are quite great. There's a train of thought that these verses are responsible for the horrors of racism throughout history. It's a terrifying concept. Maybe we can compare some parallels. Parallels, other things such as light entertainment. It can give us a respite from daily drudge. It can give us employment and creativity. Or parallels like in other parts of the Torah, which brings a concept of a moral history of the world, brings ethical teachings. Parallels like in science, Marie Curie, who pioneered cancer treatment. But Marie Curie also discovered radium, which led directly to the invention of the atomic bomb and the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki being incinerated and burned alive. Light entertainment gave us reality TV and subsequently the leader of the free world. And I jest not about this. As a Black person, I feel his politics could lead us to a return of the burning of strange fruits. And whilst religion has immeasurable value, it also stands accused of facilitating probably the most heinous horror ever in history. I'm speaking of what has been called the curse of Ham. This alleged curse, it's used to argue that Black Africans are punished and cursed to be slaves, and that they, or we, are a lower class of humans and to be subjugated. I feel it's a series of untruths that have terrorized history. Claims were made during the 1960s that anti-Black racism, A, has its roots in rabbinic statements, B, it's a clear Talmudic view, and C, it's responsible for the Western concept of Black inferiority and is driven by the rabbis. The accusation is that Judaism is the source for all racism. The rabbis were anti-Black, and Jewish literature shows this. What we saw in the 60s can only be called a show of poor inquiry, taking up a baton of really crap scholarship and passing it around in a kind of Mobius loop, perpetuating a falsehood as the next writer, the next researcher picked it up, passed it on and cited it. It was just poor scholarship. But the actual verses that we've heard today, they say, when Noah woke up from his wine and he learned what his youngest son had done, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers." Where's the falsehood? Canaan was cursed. Noah's grandson was cursed. The text gives no reason why. So how do we understand it? Well, one thing we use is critical inquiry. It's called hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is how we interpret biblical texts. It differs in Judaism very much from other religions. We take an interpretation of certain words and letters, numerical value of words, and they lead to a logical deduction of halakha, which is Jewish law. But that's not so with others, where a literal, moral, or allegorical reading comes much more to the front. Therefore, it's easier for others outside of Judaism to reach a ruling on scripture that suits a political or commercial end. Hermeneutics in other religions, very different. Let's just say that almost anything can be interpreted in some quarters, ... But even a literal reader couldn't get it so wrong. It had to have been calculated and contrived for other means, not just for moral teaching. Canaan was cursed, not Ham. We know from the rest of the chapter that Canaan relates to groupings of nations around the Levant in that area. Noah had about 17 grandsons, of which 4 were the sons of Ham. They are Cush, Mitzrayim, Put, and Canaan, which in turn became nations. Canaanites roughly make up the nation states in the area around the modern state of Israel, so areas to the north, the west, and the south. We have the Phoenicians, the Philistines, people of Western Palestine, Nineveh, Assyrians, and Sumerians. None of these are what we would recognize as people representing the African typology that we know today. Remember, it's significant that Canaan was cursed, not the other son, Cush, who has been linked to Ethiopia, Sudan, Africa. From that original list, Mitzrayim probably still exists as Egypt, but the other nations, they were all subsumed or died out. Cush is interesting. As I say, it potentially refers to Africa as represented by Ethiopia. But that verse is not about race. So how did it all come about? This grossly incorrect interpretation of Noah's curse and some crafty hermeneutics brought 2 unrelated themes, black skin and a relegation of Canaan to subhuman slaves. Ham was linked to Cush, Ethiopia, Africa. It can refer to people who have a particular color, but it's still a long stretch to link the sons, uncles, and grandsons into a curse and extrapolate from that black skin equals slavery. Maybe it's a twist on how etiology was used. So what's etiology? It's a way of describing a difference or a circumstance. So the serpent in Genesis is cursed to go on its belly, and that's why the snake has no legs. Etiology was very common in ancient societies and cultures for explaining difference. We see it all over the world. The Sandbush people of the Kalahari, they have the myth that says people have different color skin because the creator made them from different colored clay, from white clay, red clay, and dark clay. And in Ghana, we have etiology stories. They feature Kuku Anansi, who's a trickster spider. One of these stories explains why the crow, so in Ghana, the crows have a white front, a white breast. So in this story, the crow finds and steals a missionary's trunk. And in the trunk, there's a priest's dog collar. He wears that. So henceforward, crows in Ghana always have white breasts. It's etiology. But what this actually reflects is a reality that ancient societies tended to have a lack of race bias. So at the time Noah was written, there was no race bias. There was no apparent race bias. Maybe a preference for different looks, but certainly no racism. And this is throughout most of the literature. On the contrary, you find in places like Homer, in the Iliad, these classics, the Odyssey, it specifically speaks of the Ethiopian, not in a derogatory way, but he writes about blameless Ethiopians who are of physical or moral perfection. Herodotus called the Ethiopians the most handsome people on earth. And Philodemus talks about black African beauty. There's a person called Asclepiades who said of his black lover, gazing at her beauty, I melt like fire. However, what we found in them societies was that your own characteristics were more accepted as the norm, as the ideal. So the Greeks, in their writings, they did prefer their own color over the white Germanic paleness and over the dark African. It was an ideal. It wasn't a race bias. But it does get bad for Africa. When these parts of early socio-cultural traditions became mixed with a bad interpretation and used specifically to justify the subjugation of black Africans. What it appears in the literature is that the twisting of the curse was first used by Arabs who traded heavily in enslaved Africans. The interpretation of Noah's curse as bringing 2 unrelated themes, black skin and subhuman slaves, first appeared in Arab literature. From what I found, some of the earliest writings with the curse are from Christian Arabs, including a 9th century bishop of a place called Hadatta. He's called Ishtod of Merv. Hadatta no longer exists, but it was part of the Sassanian Empire. And that's something that stretched from Iran, from the Eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, to Judea, as far as Pakistan. It was during and within that particular empire that the Babylonian Talmud was written. It even had a Jewish queen at one time, Shushan, who's linked with the tomb of Esther and Mordecai. So from Christian Arab world, that dual curse first popped up in Europe around the 15th century. We started to see it in writings then. And one of the first was a person called Francisco de la Cruz. This is where we see the Christian hermeneutic tradition more actively promoting the dual curse. And around this, we saw the infamous papal bulls. Now, a papal bull is a document, an official document, or a decree from the Pope. One of the first ones was Dum Diversas in 1942, which specifically condemned Africans to perpetual servitude. The next one, not long afterwards, in 1454, I said 1942, I meant 1492, sorry. 1454 was Romanus Pontifex, which specifically targeted the Portuguese and said, you're allowed to enslave the people of West Africa. This is where my family from, and in my dad's town, the first port, one of the first castles that was built is still there by the Portuguese. It was a papal bull from the Pope. There was another really infamous one called Inter Caetera of 1593. This one specifically allowed enslavement and subjugation of Turtle Island and Abiyala. These are the places we call the Americas, the North, the Central, and the South. It was, go out, you can rule these people, slaughter the savages and the natives. Some of those words were actually in these documents, savages. And we add to that in the 18th century, in the United States, the doctrine of manifest destiny, which was a divinely ordained claim to push west and destroy the savages. And there you have it all, 500 years of carnage. And all is the question, are they a result of just these two verses in Noah? See, Arabs and the Christian countries, all which had an active involvement in enslavement of Africans, they used a fake interpretation to justify the behavior, to justify accumulating wealth. Sadly, as David Goldenberg, who's a scholar who's looked at this quite a lot, says about the false curse of Ham, the European slave Holocaust is a direct result of that pervasive thinking. And it does not exonerate later periods of taking it on as a cultural norm. How does progressive Judaism apply a lens reconciling modern morals, considering how social norms play out in this time? Does the responsibility lay on our shoulders? How hard is it to even mention this? Who bears the burden? We hear the call, tzedek, tzedok, tzedof, justice, justice shall you pursue. Action is the call, not training or learning how to do or to identify wrongs, but taking action to redress them. I say we don't need protest, we need organizers. We need to grasp our ethics to alleviate suffering, especially of the mind, but also of the person. Rabbi Lamb was an American anti-racism campaigner, and he spoke of having the freedom and the power to act, power and privilege, symptomatic benefits. Remember the argument for apartheid? This is one thing that Rabbi Lamb talked about. He said, separate cultures, this is what the argument was to justify it. Separate cultures develop better, which sounded appealing to those white minorities wishing to maintain the status quo. They wanted to keep their jobs and their Boer culture. It's lazy. It's lazy social behavior, which ignored suffering and hardship for selfish reasons. It led to apartheid becoming politically entrenched in law. And the horrors of apartheid include all intersectional impacts on women who suffered greatly, more so than is often apparent or made clear. For instance, they were classed as dependents, so women couldn't get travel permits or were work allowance. Return to the land of your ancestors. Don't read this as a physical act, but as an act of faith. Return to the position of ethics, it should say. Apartheid was symptomatic of sitting within a comfort zone. The race construct is still a central problem in society. It's structural. And it's been argued that Western modernity, or rather European modernity, from the Renaissance and using the curse of Ham, it dominated and extracted wealth from the world. It has as its goal an aim of power over nature, over culture, over wealth, over women, and it's relied on its expansion of these aims. It ran for hundreds of years until empire and imperialism's closing overture around World War I. But that gap was filled by a particularly evil man who decided not to center Europe's premise of superiority over the rest of the uncivilized world, but to center the white Aryan man as a superior, and he created industrial slaughter, revisiting the empire's darkest side. The impacts of this fake interpretation of Noah are immense. So I ask, what are we going to do for our future? What about white supremacy? For Black Jews who may feel doubly impacted? I ask again, as I started, we're in Black History Month. But how long till Black Futures Month? 55, Amy Cesare is a poet from Madrid in his powerful discourse on colonialism. A civilization that proves itself incapable of solving the problems it creates is a decadent civilization. A civilization that chooses to close its eyes to the most crucial problems is a stricken civilization. May all the names of every victim of racism and all the victims of the curse of Ham, may all their names be for a blessing. Has there ever been a greater call for peace on Shabbat? Shabbat Shalom.